Okay, so this is the Cold War lecture of History 1493. So we have ended World War II, but we've ended World War II with kind of a situation on our hands. The United States and the Soviet Union, both of them claiming, not necessarily claiming territorial jurisdiction, but certainly claiming that vast swaths of the globe are supposed to be on our side in the conflict between us. And this is going to solidify into the Cold War. The United States came out of World War II as, at that point, the world's biggest superpower. And that's not jingoism, it's not hyperbole, that's just a statement of fact. The Army was very quickly demobilized, but we still had the world's most powerful Navy, the world's most powerful Air Force. We accounted for, at that point, half of all the world's manufacturing, and we were the only country that had the atomic bomb. And FDR, and then Truman after him, were both determined that we're not going to do what we did after the First World War. We're not going to become isolationist. Most Americans, regardless of their political leanings, believe that the United States could and should lead the rest of the world to the future that we envisioned. Expanding political democracy, better living standards through capitalism, international cooperation, and all of those institutions created near the end of the war. The United Nations and the World Bank, those had been created to help in some ephemeral way achieve those goals. American political leaders also believed that our security, America's security, depended on other countries being secure. As you know, we had trusted in our own security from 1919 until 1941. And it hadn't worked out that well for us. When other countries have problems in a globalized society, it bleeds over into us as well. In particular, we believed that Europe and Asia had to be kept secure, and that our prosperity required the world economy to be rebuilt. Now, the only power that could rival the United States in any way at that point was the Soviet Union. The Soviet Army at the end of World War II occupied most of Eastern Europe, including the eastern part of Germany. Now, the Soviets had a lot of admirers that played a really crucial role in defeating Hitler. The war would not have been won as quickly as it was, for a given value of quickly, if the Soviets had not been on the Allied side. And in fact, if they'd stayed on the Axis side, if they'd kept the Nazi-Soviet pact, it might not have been won at all. So they had quite a few admirers for that. They had very quickly modernized and industrialized their nation. I mean, the countries of the Soviet Union used to be kind of the technological backwater of Europe, and they'd modernized very quickly, so they had admirers for that. They were also kind of looked at by colonial peoples around the world as a potential model of how to structure their own independence. And just like the United States, the USSR, the Soviet Union, looked forward to a world that was modeled on their society and their values. But at the end of the war, the Soviets had lost more than 20 million people, and they suffered massive industrial and agricultural devastation. So at that point, they were really not in a position to make any immediate military gains. Certainly not prepared to go to war with the United States. But the Soviets did want to build a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, where many Soviet troops were still stationed. And at the very least, they wanted a buffer zone between themselves and Germany. Germany's invaded them twice in the last 30 years. They would like a little bit of distance there. Now, when Roosevelt was still alive, he seems to have believed that the United States could keep a good friendly relationship with the Soviets once the war was over, which, in retrospect, looks a little bit naive. It seems pretty inevitable that we were going to come into conflict with them. We were allies during the war because we were fighting a common enemy. not because we shared long-term goals, not because we had common values or a common sense of history. It was just the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so almost as soon as peace was declared, that alliance began to unravel. The Soviets reneged on their promise at Yalta. They installed pro-communist governments in Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, which they said was no different from what the United States was doing in Latin America or what Britain had done with its empire. It's all the same thing to them. Of course, we didn't see it that way. In early 1946, an American diplomat stationed in Moscow, a guy named George Kennan, sent a telegram to President Truman discussing the Soviet Union, discussing communism, discussing how the United States should deal with this problem. And we call it the long telegram from Moscow, because most telegrams, you know, they cost per word, and you have to do the electrical impulses, so they're like 2 or 3 sentences. This stinking thing is like 7 pages long. It's a ridiculously long telegram. The poor telegram operator must have had carpal tunnel when it's over. But Kennan told Truman that communist ideology was essentially like a cancer, that it would make them try to expand their power. They will try to take over the world, he said. And the United States is the only country right then that had the power really to stop them, or to try and stop them. Kennan's telegram laid the foundation for the policy of containment. Now, containment says the United States should basically permanently commit ourselves to preventing the Soviets from expanding their power, to preventing the spread of communism. Well, shortly after Truman got this telegram, Winston Churchill, former Prime Minister of Great Britain, was touring the United States, and he gave a speech up in Fulton, Missouri, actually, which is right outside of Jeff City. And in that speech, Churchill declared that an Iron Curtain had descended across Europe, partitioning the free West from the communist East. And Churchill's speech helped to popularize the idea of a long-term, maybe even permanent struggle between the free world led by the U.S. and the unfree world led by the Soviets. Those two things together, the long telegram talking about containment and Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, really start to build up this feeling that this is something we're going to have to deal with, and it's going to be a long-term fight. But it's not going to be until about a year later, March of '47, that the president officially embraced the Cold War as the foundation of our foreign policy, and began to describe it as a worldwide struggle over the future of freedom. And this speech is the one that today we call the Truman Doctrine speech. When Truman took over the presidency after Roosevelt's death in '45, he found himself forced to make foreign policy decisions that he was almost totally unprepared for. You know, until he was chosen to be Roosevelt's running mate in the '44 election, Truman was really kind of a fairly undistinguished senator from Missouri. He'd gotten involved in politics because he had contacts with the Kansas City political machine. He had no foreign policy experience. But Truman did believe, and in this I think he was probably a bit wiser than Roosevelt was, he was convinced that Stalin could not be trusted. And he also believed that the United States had a responsibility to be a leader of the world. And Truman decided to go with George Kennan's idea of containment, stopping the spread of communism, and he was also very attracted to this idea of the United States leading the remnants of the free world that had gotten from Churchill's speech. The immediate occasion for the Truman Doctrine to be announced came in 1947. Great Britain, for centuries, had been certainly one of the biggest global superpowers, and in various decades, the global superpower. And they had certainly a leading role in global affairs. At the end of World War II, they could no longer really afford to do that. In particular, Britain had been giving a lot of military and financial aid to the nations of Greece and Turkey, which were strategically important countries. But they literally don't have the money to do that anymore. And they asked the United States to step in and fill that void. Now, the problems that Greece and Turkey had were not caused by the Soviet Union, but the Soviets were not above taking advantage of those problems. Both Turkey and Greece were kind of gateways to the Middle East, to the oil fields of the Middle East in particular. There was a communist revolution building in Greece. The Soviets were certainly taking advantage of that. The Soviets had started kind of leaning on Turkey to give them shipping access to the Mediterranean, which then meant access to the oil fields in the Middle East. And President Truman figured, well, gosh, if Greece falls to the communists, then so will all of the Balkan states. And if the Soviets get a toehold in the Middle East through Turkey and Greece, then we might not have access to that oil. So to get the support of the American people to intervene, Truman gave this speech in March of '47, rolled out the big guns. He said that the United States had a responsibility to support freedom-loving people wherever the commies threatened them. It's a shortish speech. It's only 18 minutes long. And in that 18 minutes, Truman used the word free or freedom 24 times. Now, the Truman Doctrine built on the idea of a world split between freedom and slavery, and on that old vision of the American cause to defend liberty against the forces of darkness, etc., etc. And the Truman Doctrine created the language that most Americans used to understand the world around us after World War II. Truman managed to convince both Republicans and Democrats to support his policy, which started a long period of bipartisan support for the containment of communism. I mean, when Republicans and Democrats couldn't agree on anything else during the 50s and 60s, they could at least agree that they all hate the Reds. Now, Truman's speech was really only about getting $400 million to send to aid Turkey and Greece. But it reverberated way beyond that, certainly farther than I can imagine Truman anticipated. I don't think that he ever thought that 40 years after he gave this speech, another American president would be using his exact words, talking about the American responsibility to freedom-loving peoples around the globe. But Reagan did, Clinton did, even George W. Bush did. And Truman's rhetoric in this speech certainly suggested, if not outright said, the United States has a permanent global responsibility. Now, this speech set the precedent for the United States to give aid to anti-communist regimes around the world, even if those regimes were not necessarily democratic. It also created the idea of building global military alliances to help us in this fight against the Soviets. Now, soon after Truman's speech, the United States created several new national security agencies that were completely immune to democratic oversight, meaning they don't answer to the people. Things like the Atomic Energy Commission, the National Security Council, the CIA. Now, the language of the Truman Doctrine and the future that it sketched of open-ended worldwide responsibilities for the United States alarmed a lot of Americans. But military action was just one part of containment, of stopping the spread of communism. Secretary of State George Marshall spelled out the other part in June of '47. The Secretary of State had pledged the United States to contribute billions of dollars to help pay for the economic recovery of Western Europe. 2 years after the end of the war, most of the continent was still in ruins. There were parts of Dresden, Germany, that were literally still smoldering. Food shortages were widespread. Inflation was rampant. If you could find food, it was probably on the black market, and the prices were absolutely unbelievable. And the countries that were hit worst by this also saw a growing sympathy toward communism. Like France and Italy, those were two of the countries that were hardest hit. And American politicians were afraid that if Western Europe in general and these particularly devastated countries were not stabilized in some way, they would fall to communism. They would become part of the Soviet orbit. So the Marshall Plan was meant to fight the idea that capitalism was in decline. It was meant to fight the idea that communism was the best way to go. Marshall believed that the threat to the United States was not so much Soviet military power as much as instability, economic and political instability. He believed that those were breeding grounds for communism. Marshall said that this plan was not directed against any particular country, not directed against any doctrine. It was directed against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. He said that freedom meant more than just not being communist. It required the political and social conditions where free institutions can grow. In a way, the Marshall Plan is kind of building on the old progressive effective freedom idea, right? We have to create the foundations where real freedom can exist. The Marshall Plan aimed to create a better standard of living, full employment for workers and farmers, greater production, and it overwhelmingly succeeded. The Marshall Plan was one of the best uses of foreign aid money ever. By 1950, just 3 years into the program, production, industrial production and farm production both in Western Europe weren't just back at pre-war levels, they actually exceeded pre-war levels. And we did offer money to the Soviet Union and to various Eastern European countries that were part of the Soviet sphere, but the Soviets refused to participate. They figured that we would use that money to try and control the economies of Eastern Europe, which, you know, is a fair assumption to make. So the Marshall Plan kind of helped to solidify the division of Europe. West is for the United States, East is for the Soviets. At the same time, the United States worked out the GATT agreement. It's the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which was supposed to stimulate free trade, was supposed to create a big market for American goods. And GATT was in place until 1994. Then it was replaced with the World Trade Organization, which still exists. The United States also began the economic reconstruction of Japan. And that was quite a bit more controversial. It's one thing to help rebuild France. France is an allied nation. It's one thing to help rebuild Italy. Italy was technically an Axis nation, but they switched sides pretty early on. Japan, though, was the enemy throughout the war, and Japan is the only country that successfully attacked the United States. So there were a lot of people not real sure that we should be helping them at all. General Douglas MacArthur was in charge of the post-war occupation of Japan, and he believed basically if we help them rebuild, they will never be our enemy again. Partly because of gratitude, but you can't rely too much on that, but largely because if the United States helps Japan rebuild, the United States has a great deal of control over how they rebuild. By the 1950s, thanks to American assistance, new technologies were being developed. Absentee landlordism had been abolished, so most tenant farmers were able to get their own lands. Japan had a new democratic constitution, and the Japanese economic recovery was in full swing. And they have been, since then, a fairly solid ally of the United States. Meanwhile, the Cold War is intensifying, and despite the Marshall Plan and despite other efforts, it's becoming increasingly militaristic. At the end of World War II, each of the four biggest allies, the Soviets, the US, Britain, and France, took control of a section of Germany. The Soviets took East Germany. They took about a third of the country, which, you know, fair. They were the first country in there, so we're lucky they didn't take everything. We also partitioned the capital city of Berlin. Berlin, Germany is in the eastern part. It's surrounded by Soviet territory. The US, Britain, and France started building a new West German government that would be aligned with us during the Cold War. And in June of 1948, they announced a separate currency, a separate monetary system for West Germany. Well, the Soviets pitched a fit, and they cut off all road and rail traffic from the west into the city of West Berlin, which is, remember, inside their territory. Even though 2/3 of it is controlled by the US, Britain, and France, it is surrounded on all sides by Soviet territory. Stalin would only supply their section of the city, and now he has cut off any on-ground way for us to supply our side of the city. So for 11 months, an airlift took place. Western planes supplied fuel and food to their zones of the city. When Stalin lifted the blockade in May of '49, the Truman administration won a major victory. But soon, two new nations were emerging, East Germany and West Germany, each of them allied with a different side in the Cold War, and the city of Berlin itself remained divided. The western part of Berlin stayed this very isolated enclave within East Germany, and Germany wouldn't be officially reunified until 1991. Also in '49, the Soviets tested their first atomic bomb, which ended our monopoly on that weapon. That same year, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations established NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a mutual defense pact, basically, against any potential Soviet attack. West Germany was allowed to be part of NATO, and that kind of freaked people out. They were afraid of, you let Germany rearm, you know what Germany does when they rearm. But the biggest, and I think this was really surprising to a lot of people, the biggest defender of Germany, the country that was most willing to let them join, was actually France. And you know, during the war, France had been absolutely overrun by Nazi Germany. They have centuries of problems with Germany, that they're willing to let them join. They believed that West Germany could be a buffer zone against the Soviet Union, and they also believed that by bringing it into contact with the former Allies, it could kind of be tamed, it could be civilized again. NATO was the first long-term military alliance between the United States and Europe since the Revolution. The Soviets formed their own Eastern European alliance called the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Let's see, later in '49, this is just not a great year for us. In late '49, the communist side of the Chinese Civil War, led by Mao Zedong, won, which was a big setback for the Truman Doctrine, a big setback for containment, because containment says we will stop the spread of communism. The Truman Doctrine says the United States is committed to stopping the spread of communism, and all of a sudden there are 1 billion more communists in the world. Holy crap. Well, Republicans accused President Truman of losing China. So the Truman administration, in a fit of pique, refused to recognize Mao's government as legitimate and blocked it from taking China's seat on the United Nations Security Council. Until the 1970s, the United States insisted that the old regime, the regime in exile in Taiwan, was the legitimate government of China. So in the wake of basically all of 1949 and all this crap, the National Security Council approved a call for permanent military buildup to allow the United States to start a global crusade against communism. Now, initially, this military buildup focused on Europe. That's where we kind of expected any trouble to be. But it was in Asia where the Cold War suddenly turned hot. During World War II, the nation of Korea, which was just one Korea back then, had been occupied by Japan. And after the war, like Germany was, it was divided into zones. The Chinese and Soviets got the north, we got the south. The person in charge of the South Korean government in the late 1940s, he was technically an American ally, technically a Western ally. He was not a communist figure, but we really didn't trust him. We considered him to be overly militaristic, way too enthusiastic about potentially starting a nuclear war. A little bit scary that way. His name was Syngman Rhee, and he repeatedly sent messages to the United States and the other Western allies saying, the Chinese have given tanks to North Korea, so we need tanks because North Korea is about to invade. And, you know, we got this message and went, no way. We think he's just fooling us. We think he's trying to build up his military so he can invade the North first. So we didn't do anything. And then we get a message saying the Soviets have sent airplanes to North Korea, to the Kim regime in North Korea, which is still in control of North Korea. So we need airplanes, or we need something, because now they've got tanks, now they've got airplanes, and they're going to invade us. And every time he sent these messages saying what the Chinese or the Soviets had given to the Kim regime, the United States didn't believe him. We trusted him less than we trusted the communist regime in North Korea, and that turned out to be a mistake. In June of 1950, the North Korean army invaded the South with tanks and airplanes. They wanted to reunify the country. Korea should be one Korea, but they wanted to reunify the country under communist control. And North Korean soldiers very quickly overran most of the Korean peninsula. Now, the Truman administration viewed the Korea situation as a test case for containment. So they persuaded the United Nations to authorize the use of force to push back the North Korean invasion. Now, you'd think the Soviets and China, they both have seats, permanent seats on the United Nations Security Council, which means that they both have veto power over any military action that the United Nations wants to take. And neither of them did. Well, the problem was the United States refused to allow the Chinese government, the communist Chinese government, to take their seat. And in retaliation for that, the Soviets refused to show up at all. So when the vote was taken, the two powers that could have vetoed the Korean War weren't there to do it. Bad idea there, Stalin. Now, it was allegedly a joint UN operation, but U.S. troops did most of the fighting. General MacArthur pushed the North Koreans back to their own border, and then we had basically a stalemate for a couple of years until North and South Korea agreed to kind of go back to the status quo. There's actually no formal peace treaty ending the Korean War, which is why today when North Korea stomps around and says we've been at war with the South for 60 years, they are telling the truth. The Korean War technically has never ended. We're just not fighting anymore. The Korean War in 1950, in the early 1950s, showed how far the world had moved past that global harmony idea that FDR had wanted, that was supposed to be helped along by the United Nations. We stopped talking about one world. Now we're talking about a divided world with the free West and the communist East. Now, among other things, the Cold War was an ideological struggle. It is a battle for the hearts and minds of people throughout the world, which is another phrase that you hear all the time now. Like any other war, like a hot war, the Cold War needed popular support, needs propaganda, and the idea of freedom was central to that. During the 1950s, freedom became the theme of massive amounts of academic research and journalism and mass culture. In many ways, the Cold War created the framework for how we discuss freedom even today. One of the weirder Cold War battlefields involved American history and culture. Many scholars decided that we needed to hide the bad stuff, not talk about the things we'd gotten wrong before. So they decided that the ideas of pluralism, intolerance, and equality had existed forever in the United States. They ignored the very powerful racial and ethnic strains that certainly had not yet gone away. The National Security Agency used the code name Militant Liberty for their program to get textbooks to erase the nasty bits of history, take out references to nasty things like the KKK and Indian removal and Chinese exclusion, and just kind of pretend that that had never happened. They also encouraged Hollywood to produce anti-communist movies, showing the dangers of being friends with communists. The Red Menace is one. I Married a Communist it was not intended to be a comedy. If you watch it today, it is absolutely freaking hilarious. The CIA and the Defense Department paired up to sponsor artists as well. During the Cold War, arts funding was top secret, partly because Congress didn't want to spend the money, and partly because one of the things that we accused the Soviets of doing was forcing their artists to conform to their political agenda, and we didn't want to be accused of the same thing. And it is true, the Soviet Union tried to drum up support by sponsoring tours of their ballet companies and symphonies and folk dance troupes, which backfired really badly on occasion. In 1961, one of their dancers jumped a barricade at the Paris airport and demanded political asylum. So the Soviets cut down on their tours for a while after that. But the CIA did the same thing. We funded overseas tours and conferences and art exhibits. Works produced by totally apolitical artists became weapons in the Cold War. The CIA strongly promoted artists like Jackson Pollock. They said that Pollock's abstract expressionism embodied the kind of freedom and individualism and artistic expression that artists in communist nations couldn't have. The CIA funded the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. They arranged exhibitions of American artistic freedom. Now, along with freedom, the other big mobilizing concept of the Cold War, the opposite, was totalitarianism. Now, the word totalitarian came from sort of the way we described fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. Very aggressive, very ideologically driven countries that bring all of civil society under the control of the government. The churches, the unions, everything under control of the government. Now, according to the idea of totalitarianism, those countries have no room for individual rights, no room for an alternate value system. So those countries cannot be changed from inside. There's no internal revolution. There can't be a changing of the guard after an election because a totalitarian government has such total control, allegedly, that those things simply cannot happen. By 1950, totalitarianism, the word, had become shorthand to describe anybody who was not explicitly on our side in the Cold War. Now, none of these communist governments, certainly not the Soviet Union, they were not actually as totalitarian as we had believed, because they did collapse from inside. It did not take an outside force going in. It took regime change and revolution in those countries, which if totalitarianism were an accurate description of those countries, could not have happened. Now, you look at a place like North Korea today, it is fair to describe that as a totalitarian nation. And the idea of totalitarianism kind of reinforced the idea that a powerful government could be a danger to freedom, which is very different from the view of government that we had during the FDR years, yeah? I mean, back then, powerful government had helped to promote freedom, especially for working people. So this is a big switch, and it's going to come to full power in the 1970s and 1980s. Just like the Civil War redefined American freedom, and the fight with the Nazis reshaped it again, the Cold War did the same. Whatever the Soviets stood for, or whatever somebody could claim that they stood for, was seen as the opposite of freedom. This is where we develop our paralyzing fear of the word socialism, or socialized, like socialized medicine. You know, FDR had wanted full health care, universal health care. They had pushed for that to be part of the New Deal. And even though it didn't succeed, nobody called him a crazy socialist. Nobody said he was un-American to try and do it. But in the 1950s, and even today, if you can find a way to say that your political opponent is even maybe kind of socialist or supports socialized anything, you will get a whole mess of voters ready to raise hell for you. When FDR proposed government-run health care in the 30s, the American Medical Association shot it down on the grounds that it would interfere with their profit. When Truman brought it up again in 1949, all they had to do was accuse him of being a socialist. Kill that bill dead. Public housing was condemned as socialized housing. And of course, because the proper full-length term for a communist is godless pinko commie red, Congress decided that we needed to increase our national commitment to religion. And one of the ways they did this was by changing the text of the Pledge of Allegiance. And the original text of the Pledge of Allegiance, incidentally, was written by an American socialist, but it did not contain the phrase "under God." So when my grandparents were in school, they said the original version. In the 1950s, the phrase "under God" was added as part of showing that we are better than the communists. The Cold War also affected the idea of human rights, a belief that we need to be concerned with human rights, but more importantly, sort of a development of which rights we are most concerned with, I guess. The idea that there are rights that are inherent and apply to every person came out of the 1700s during the Enlightenment. It was part of the justification for the French Revolution and the Haitian Revolution and the American Revolution. The atrocities that were committed during World War II, as well as that idea of the four freedoms, forcefully raised the issue of human rights again. After the war, the Allies put numerous Germans on trial in Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. The trials resulted in prison terms for many Nazi officials and executions for 10 of their leaders. In 1948, the United Nations General Assembly approved the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The declaration was written by a committee that was headed by former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. This declaration identified a really broad range of rights that the writers believed should be shared by all people, including freedom of speech and religious tolerance, and right to an adequate standard of living and access to housing and education and medical care. Now, the core principle of this document is that the way a nation treats its own people should be subject to outside evaluation. And that slowly became part of the language that we use to talk about freedom. Like, I remember at the end of the Cold War, because I'm old enough to remember that, we heard a little bit about the Soviet military threat to America, but we heard a lot more about how terribly the Soviet citizens had to live, how terribly their government treated them, they didn't have enough to eat, all of these other things. So how they treated their citizens became important. In 2003, the invasion of Iraq, yeah, we heard quite a bit about alleged weapons of mass destruction, which never existed, but we also heard about how terribly Saddam Hussein treated the Iraqi people. The concern with people who are not us owes a lot to the Declaration of Human Rights. But during the 1950s, the Cold War shaped the way we talked about human rights. Both the United States and the Soviet Union liked parts of this declaration, but we really disliked other parts. The Soviets claimed that they provided all of their citizens with economic and social rights, but they kind of ignored that part about democratic freedoms and civil liberties. Now, many Americans pointed out that we provide civil liberties and political rights, but we don't want to do those economic freedoms because that is a step down the slippery slope to socialism. Now, Eleanor Roosevelt and the other authors of this saw the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as a whole and complete body of principles. Political rights can't be separated from economic rights, they believed. But to make it easier for member nations to agree to, the United Nations divided the Declaration into two separate covenants. There's the Civil and Political Rights Covenant, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, government by consent of the governed, and then there's the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Everybody has the right to an adequate standard of living and secure housing and education, etc., etc. It took until 1992 for the U.S. Congress to ratify the civil and political rights, and we've never approved the second one. Now, with the end of World War II and heading into this new conflict with the Soviets, President Truman's first domestic task was to figure out how to transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy. Now, August 45, war is over. 12 million men are still in uniform for the United States, and they want to come home. The demobilization actually happened very quickly. Within a year, the armed forces had been cut by 75%. There were only 3 million men still in uniform. Some returning soldiers found it difficult to adjust. The divorce rate in 1945 was double its pre-war level. Others took advantage of the GI Bill to get home loans and set up businesses and go to college. The majority of returning soldiers entered the labor force without much trouble. About 2 million women lost their jobs. The government abolished a lot of those wartime agencies that had set price control and governed labor relations. There was a brief rise in prices, a little bit of inflation. In the immediate aftermath of the war, President Truman wanted to make sure that we didn't slide back into the Depression. So he wanted to revive the New Deal. Truman called his program the Fair Deal, and it focused on improving the social safety net, raising the living standards of ordinary citizens. He wanted Congress to increase the minimum wage, to enact a national health insurance program, to expand public housing, to expand Social Security, to provide more educational funding. It was almost like he was trying to out-Roosevelt the New Deal. But in the 1946 congressional elections, a large number of middle-class voters were alarmed by some of the labor unrest caused by returning veterans, and they chose to vote Republicans. Many working-class voters just stayed home, and that's a lethal combination for the Democratic Party. For the first time since the 1920s, Republicans gained control of both houses of Congress, and they stopped the Fair Deal program. Instead, they cut taxes for wealthy Americans, and over the president's veto, they passed the Taft-Hartley Act. And that was designed to strip away many of the protections for organized labor. The Taft-Hartley Act allowed the president to rather arbitrarily suspend strikes. It banned sympathy strikes. It also authorized states to pass right-to-work laws, which is the kind of labor law that Oklahoma has, that Kansas has, most of the states in this area have. Right to work, on the one hand, means if you're going into an industry that is traditionally unionized and you don't want to join a union, you don't have to. On the other hand, it means that if you do want to join a union, it is much more difficult for you to do so. People have been fired for attempting to form unions, for attempting to join unions. You get a reputation for being potentially sympathetic toward unions. In some places, you're blacklisted. Right-to-work states have lower median incomes. They have much higher rates of workplace deaths. In addition to the right-to-work law, Congress also forced union officials, elected officials, to swear an oath that they weren't damn dirty commies. Now, as part of the Fair Deal, Truman had envisioned this very broad civil rights platform. During his first term, he really did reach out in unexpected ways to African Americans. The war had inspired a lot more militancy, and it had led many white Americans to reject America's racial policies as being too much like Hitler. In the years that immediately followed World War II, the status of black Americans had a prominence in national affairs that was unheard of since Reconstruction. Between 1945 and 1951, 11 northern states created their own Fair Employment Practices Commissions. A bunch of cities passed laws against job discrimination and discrimination in public facilities. A very broad civil rights coalition evolved that included labor and religious groups and black organizations, all of them supporting these anti-discrimination laws. The NAACP, right, we talked about them getting much larger during the war. They launched a voter registration campaign in the southern states. By 1952, 20% of African Americans in the Upper South had been registered to vote. It was 7 times more than had been registered in 1940. Of course, in the Deep South, the numbers barely changed at all. But law enforcement started to kind of take lynching a little bit seriously. 1952 is the first year on record that no known lynchings took place in the United States. Another example of changing race relations was the sudden integration of Major League Baseball. In 1947, the Brooklyn Dodgers recruited Jackie Robinson. And Jackie Robinson used to play for the Kansas City Monarchs. They were the Kansas City Negro League baseball team. And I'm not just saying it because they were local, but they were really the best of that league, the best team in that league. They were incredible. They produced a lot of really amazing athletes, and Jackie Robinson is one of them. Robinson was certainly one of the most skilled athletes of our time. He was also committed to civil rights. In fact, during the war, he had served in the Army during the war, and he had been arrested for refusing to move to the back of the bus in Fort Hood, Texas. Pointed out that he was a soldier, he was a U.S. soldier in uniform, on his own base. He shouldn't have to move to the back of the bus. When he was drafted by the Dodgers, they made him promise that he wouldn't retaliate against any kind of abuse, and Lord, he took a lot of abuse. And his dignity in the face of that won him nationwide respect. And his athletic prowess won him the Rookie of the Year award. His success opened the door for the full integration of baseball and then other sports. And it was just another crack in the glass of overall segregation. President Truman had appointed a commission on civil rights. And in 1947, they published a really very stark report on racial inequality in the United States. The commission said that the federal government needed to take responsibility for abolishing segregation, for making sure that there is equal treatment for all citizens in housing and education and the court system. Truman worried very much that racism would hurt our ability to fight the spread of communism. Truman said that if the United States wants to offer a choice between freedom in the U.S. or enslavement in communism, then we need to make damn sure that our freedom is actually free. In February of 1948, Truman took the recommendations of that commission and presented it to Congress, this very ambitious civil rights program as part of the Fair Deal. He wanted a permanent civil rights commission. He wanted federal laws against lynching, against the poll tax. He wanted federal laws to protect equal access to jobs and education. Now, Truman completely expected that Congress will shoot down every single part of it, and he was right. But there is something that a president can do without the approval of Congress. Now, the president's other title is Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Military. And with that title, the president can issue executive orders. In July of 1948, after giving Congress the chance to do the right thing and them not doing it, Truman issued an executive order to fully desegregate the military. The armed services became the first major institution in the United States, not just to try and end segregation, but to actively promote racial integration and actually try to root out racist practices. The Korean War was the first war since the Revolution to be fought by an integrated army. And just like the integration of baseball, it helped to prove that an integrated America is stronger than a segregated America. Now, Truman genuinely, personally despised discrimination and supported civil rights. But his focus on civil rights was also part of his strategy to get reelected in 1948. He wanted to build up FDR's old New Deal coalition, his old electoral base. And so when Truman made these demands for health insurance and labor rights and civil rights and public education, that was his attempt to build up that voter base. At the 1948 Democratic Convention, though, the Democratic Party split. The keynote speaker at the 48 Democratic Convention was the young mayor of Minneapolis, Hubert Humphrey. And he gave this wonderful speech, ended it by saying, urging the members of the Democratic Party to walk out of the shadow of states' rights and into the sunlight of human rights. Whereupon many Southern delegates walked out into the sunlight of Minneapolis and left the convention entirely. Well, the convention kind of collapsed. And the delegates and their supporters were known as Dixiecrats. Basically, they're the Southern wing of the Democratic Party. Officially, they called themselves the States' Rights Democratic Party, and they nominated their own candidate for president, then the governor of South Carolina, Strom Thurmond. Now, despite the fact that the Dixiecrat platform was built almost entirely on refuting all of Truman's civil rights policies, Thurmond insisted that it was not a racist platform. Instead, Thurmond compared President Truman to Hitler, because I guess Hitler had such a strong stand for human rights. And there were four major parties running in the 48 presidential election. Truman is the official Democrat, Thurmond the Dixiecrat, former Vice President Henry Wallace is running as a progressive, for like the one remaining progressive voter, and Thomas Dewey ran for the Republicans. Now, the Republicans threw massive amounts of money behind Dewey, but Truman's ideas for uniting the old Democratic base worked, and he won re-election. Now, at the end of the First World War, we talked about wanting to go back to that return to normalcy, to kind of forget all this nastiness happened, let's go back to the way things were. After the Second World War, everybody realized it was not going to happen. The military-industrial complex created during World War II is not going to be temporary. The United States kept a very large, very active federal government, poured a lot of money into weapons development, into building overseas bases. All of a sudden, anytime the government wanted support for a project, they said it was tied to national security. Aid for higher education, national security. Interstate highway system, national security. Well, because if the Soviets ever decide to nuke the hell out of Tulsa, people need to be able to get out fast. So we will build these wide, multi-lane interstate highways going in and out of the major cities. Tulsa was not considered a huge potential target. Dallas was at the time, which is why the Dallas interstate system is so massive. The Cold War also encouraged a culture of secrecy and dishonesty. We didn't find out until decades later that both the Soviets and the U.S. government carried out experiments on their own troops, exposed them to chemical, biological, nuclear weapons without the soldiers knowing about it. Nuclear tests were conducted on Pacific Islands, out in the Nevada desert, with no public warnings, exposed thousands of civilians to radiation that caused cancer and birth defects and all sorts of nasty things. Like, this is a picture of the Las Vegas Strip in the very early 1950s. And in the middle, just in case you can't see it, there is a mushroom cloud. Now, they're testing nuclear weapons so close to Las Vegas that you can see the mushroom clouds from the Vegas Strip. Now, Cold War military spending helped to fuel economic growth. It supported economic research that didn't just lead to better weaponry, but also improve civilian life, better aircraft and computers and medicine and other big projects. A lot of that research took place at universities. So the Cold War also helped to expand higher education. All of a sudden, we've got big-name research universities. The Cold War also shaped immigration policy. Refugees from communist countries were allowed to enter outside of the quota system. The international embarrassment of America's racial policies will eventually contribute to the end of legal segregation. And just like any other war, the Cold War encouraged people to draw a very sharp line between good patriotic Americans and those who might be disloyal. Containment, not just of communism, but of unpopular opinions of all kinds, took place at home and abroad. And it's exactly at the moment when the United States was claiming to celebrate freedom as the foundation of American life. The freedom to dissent came heavily under attack. Anybody who could be linked to communism, even just by lies, was considered an enemy of freedom. So we call this period of assault on civil liberties McCarthyism, but it actually started several years before Senator McCarthy burst onto the national scene. He's not going to become prominent until 1950. But in 1947, President Truman established a loyalty review program. Government employees who were accused through some sort of weird, nefarious back alley channels of potentially being disloyal were required to demonstrate that they were good patriots without being able to confront their accusers, and in some cases without actually being told what they were accused of. The loyalty programs uncovered, again, not a single case of espionage, but several hundred people were fired due to accusations, and a couple thousand more resigned in protest. Also in 1947, the House Un-American Activities Committee, which had been established back in the 1930s but hadn't really done much yet, they launched a series of hearings about communist influence in Hollywood. They called on well-known screenwriters and directors like Elia Kazan, the director of On the Waterfront, and actors like Humphrey Bogart and Jimmy Stewart and Lucille Ball to testify against people that they knew. Celebrities like Gary Cooper and Ronald Reagan and Walt Disney testified that the movie industry harbored communists. But there were 10 unfriendly witnesses who refused to testify and refused to name names. And they refused on the grounds that these hearings violate the First Amendment. You have the right to your own beliefs. You have the right to assemble, regardless of the beliefs of the people you're assembling with, as long as your actions are not illegal. Well, the committee charged them, they were called the Hollywood 10, charged them with contempt of Congress, and they served jail times of 6 months up to a year. Hollywood studios blacklisted them, along with more than 200 others who were accused of communist sympathies or simply who refused to testify. A series of highly publicized legal cases followed, which fueled the growing anti-communist hysteria. Alger Hiss was an official working in the State Department, so he worked for the Secretary of State. He was accused of passing documents to the Soviets. He, of course, denied the charge, and there is still a lot of controversy surrounding whether he did anything, or in fact, whether some of the documents he was accused of passing even existed. Much of this is still classified, so we don't know. A jury could not find him guilty of actual espionage because, again, there's no proof, but they did find him guilty of perjury, and they sentenced him to 5 years. A young congressman from California, Richard Nixon, came to national prominence because of his very dogged pursuit of Alger Hiss. The most sensational trial involved Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. They were a working-class Jewish communist couple in New York City. In 1951, the Rosenbergs were convicted of conspiracy to pass secrets about the bomb to the Soviets. Now, got to be absolutely clear about this. Julius Rosenberg was guilty. He did pass on information. But the case against Julius Rosenberg rested on classified documents that could not be revealed in court. So you're sitting on a jury, and you're supposed to, certainly in the death penalty case, be able to find someone guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. And the prosecutor comes to you and says, well, we've got mounds of evidence, but I can't show you any of it. You just have to take my word for it. Now, he did do it. He was guilty. But once those documents were eventually declassified, they appeared to be much less important than the prosecution claimed. Nonetheless, he was guilty. Against Ethel Rosenberg, though, there was no real evidence. Prosecutors seem to have included her in the charge as a way to pressure Julius into confessing. But in this atmosphere of hysteria, their conviction was certain. Now, they were not convicted of treason, and they were not convicted of espionage. They were convicted only of conspiracy. But the judge in this case called their crime worse than murder, and they were both executed in 1953. Now, the trials of HIST and the Rosenbergs helped to reinforce the idea that there's this army of Soviet spies at work in the United States. And in this atmosphere, a little-known senator from Wisconsin suddenly emerged as the big commie hunter, and he gave his name to this anti-communist crusade. Joseph McCarthy was a very skilled liar, even remarkable for a politician. He had won election to the Senate partly because he lied about his war record. He claimed that he had flown combat missions in the Pacific during World War II, when in fact it appears that he was on a plane at some point in his life, and he was enlisted in the military. Doesn't appear to have flown at all during the war, certainly not as a pilot. In a speech at Wheeling, West Virginia, nobody's really paying attention to him. McCarthy decides to stir things up. He announced that he had a list. I hold in my hand a list of 205 communists known to be working for the State Department. Well, in other speeches, he said the list had 57 names, or 113 names, or 62 names. McCarthy privately admitted to another senator that the list he held up during the first speech was a dry cleaning ticket. And the charge was absolutely preposterous. The numbers changed every time he spoke, and McCarthy never identified a single person who was genuinely guilty. But McCarthy was a genius at self-promotion. He was the head of a Senate subcommittee, and he used that position to hold hearings and level wild accusations against any individual that he thought stood in his way. And as he gained more power, he started to go against entire government agencies, including the Defense Department. Now, in the beginning, many Republicans supported his rampage as a weapon against President Truman. But McCarthy very quickly became an embarrassment to the party. Dwight Eisenhower was elected president in 1952, and he was a Republican. And they expected that McCarthy would go easier on him because he's a Republican, but McCarthy didn't do it. He questioned Eisenhower's personal commitment to anti-communism. Now, this is General freaking Eisenhower, right? And Eisenhower despised McCarthy, especially once McCarthy started attacking the military, but he refused to make any kind of public statement about it. He did not want to give McCarthy any legitimacy. Now, McCarthy's rampage lasted for over 2 years, until finally he overextended himself. There's this wonderful new technology that more and more American families had access to in the early 1950s called television. And McCarthy decided that he wanted his hearings on people working for the Defense Department and the Army to be televised so everybody could see how awesome he was. Well, these nationally televised hearings showed McCarthy to be a bully who browbeat witnesses, made sweeping accusations with no evidence, no basis in fact. And it just made him look terrible. The dramatic high point came when McCarthy attacked a young lawyer who worked for Joseph Welch. He was the Army's chief attorney. And Welch flipped out, very calmly, but flipped out. So he said, "If there is a God in heaven, it will do neither you nor your cause any good. At long last, sir, have you no sense of decency." Well, McCarthy's embarrassed. The people who had supported him were embarrassed. The Senate censured McCarthy for his behavior. He continued to hold his seat in the Senate, but his fellow congressmen would refuse to listen to him speak. Some of them would very conspicuously get up and walk out when he took the floor. He died 3 years later. But the word McCarthyism entered our political vocabulary. It's a shorthand for character assassination and abuse of power and guilt by association. Now here's the rub with McCarthy. There were communists working in the State Department. There were actual communist spies working in the Defense Department. There were actual communist spies working in just about every broad department of the U.S. government. They just weren't any of the people that McCarthy went after. McCarthy used his position and his power and his committee to go after the people that he felt politically stood in his way. And he used the fear of communism. He used the Cold War as a weapon against his political enemies. His political enemies were non-actual communists. There were actual communists in the U.S. government. And because of the circus that McCarthy created over here, they were able to do their work over here with nobody noticing. And by the early 1950s, this anti-communist crusade had created a pervasive, oppressive atmosphere of fear. One person described Washington, D.C. as a city full of spying and suspicion and defamation by rumor. But anti-communism was as much a local crusade as a national one. States created their own committees, modeled on the House Un-American Activities Committee. They investigated suspected communists and other critics. Police departments built red squads that gathered information on thousands of citizens. About 150 towns and cities all across the nation passed laws designed to basically kick out any communist who might be there. New Rochelle, New York, required all communists to register name and address with the police department, and then that list will be made public. Birmingham, Alabama, told all communists to leave the city or be fined $100 a day. States and towns required loyalty oaths of teachers and pharmacists and other various professionals. Some states would not allow communists to get a driver's license or a fishing license. And in Indiana, they were not allowed to work as professional wrestlers. I don't even know. Local anti-communist groups forced the public libraries to take dangerously un-American books off the shelves. You know, like Robin Hood. Robin Hood robs from the rich, gives to the poor. He's a communist. Can't have him in the kids' libraries. The State Department went into libraries on military bases and cleansed them of books by controversial writers like Thomas Paine. You know, the guy who wrote Common Sense, that helped develop the American Revolution. Yeah, we don't want soldiers reading him. He's a dangerous subversive. Henry David Thoreau, he's too dangerous. Former Vice President Henry Wallace is too dangerous to be on the shelves in military libraries. Universities refused to let left-wing speakers appear on campus. They fired teachers who refused to sign loyalty oaths or refused to testify against their colleagues. And the courts did nothing to stop it, which is an almost complete reversal from the 1930s and the early 40s. Civil liberties had been fairly important to the court back then. But in 1951, in Dennis v. United States, the Supreme Court upheld jail sentences for Communist Party members, even though the charges concerned their personal beliefs, not any action that they had taken. At its height, from the late 40s to around 1960, The anti-communist crusade powerfully changed American politics and culture. Republicans in Congress used the drumbeat of anti-communism to block Truman's political program. The most important actions that Congress took were the ones that they passed over the president's veto. Now, Truman did succeed in getting Congress to pass a law in 1950 that expanded Social Security to the self-employed. Otherwise, though, the New Deal and the idea of a social safety net began to fade. Now, every political and social group had to cooperate with the anti-communist crusade or face destruction, which was a nasty experience for labor groups and civil rights groups. Communists had been some of their biggest supporters, some of their most effective organizers. After the passage of the Taft-Hartley Act in '47, though, the CIO had to expel numerous left-wing officials, and they refused to recognize 11-member unions representing nearly 1 million workers because of this anti-communist hysteria. The civil rights movement also underwent a transformation. Now, at first, mainstream civil rights groups, like the NAACP and the Urban League, strongly protested the loyalty programs. They asked why communism was considered un-American, but racism was not. Anti-communist investigators went hard after civil rights leaders, even so far as to say that if they were present at an interracial gathering, it was proof of disloyalty. A few prominent black leaders, most notably Paul Robeson and W.B. Du Bois, continued to be outspoken critics of the Cold War. Most of them felt like they had no real choice but to go along. The NAACP purged communists from their local branches. When the government took away Paul Robeson's passport and indicted W.E.B. Du Bois, very few prominent Americans protested. The charge against Du Bois was he had failed to register as an agent of the Soviet Union. Well, he wasn't an agent of the Soviet Union. It was so absurd that even at the height of McCarthyism, the judge dismissed it. But still, just the idea that he could be arrested for something that was so patently false. The Cold War caused a shift in thinking and tactics among civil rights groups. Black organizations kind of had to embrace the language of the Cold War and then turn it to their own purpose. They insisted that racism damaged America's image, and it plays into the Soviets' hands. So they helped to cement Cold War ideology as the foundation of political culture, while also complicating the idea of American freedom. All in all, though, the height of the Cold War was not a good time to raise questions about America's imperfections. After about '48, Truman's flurry of civil rights activity faded. State and local laws banning discrimination mostly went unenforced. Given the way that dissent and criticism was persecuted, and given the widespread belief that criticism was disloyal, many people began to shy away from the civil rights movement. Now, this waning of interest in civil rights is only going to be temporary, just extremely temporary. But it happened at a crucial moment when the United States was beginning to experience the greatest economic boom in our history. The rise of an affluent society transformed the lives of many Americans. It offered new opportunities for tens of millions of white citizens. But it left African Americans trapped in declining rural parts of the South, in urban ghettos up north. The contrast between new opportunities and widespread prosperity for whites and the continued discrimination against blacks would soon inspire a civil rights revolution and another redefinition of American freedom. And that is it for the Cold War lecture, and we'll go on talking about civil rights when we get to the next one.